Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we start our coverage of the 2020 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen later in the year for the World Championship. Many thought this tournament would not happen since everything else seems to be canceled these days, but the tournament started today, and it looks like it is going to continue. We have 8 of the top players in the world. It's going to be a good one. In round 1, we had some fireworks. Particular game we're going to be going over. White's going to be played by Drawmaster himself, Giri, and Black's going to be played by my dark horse, and that is the Magnus Slayer himself, Jan Nepo. We'll go and get started with Giri. He plays knight to f3. We have knight f6, c4, c5, knight c3, and then knight c6. So getting into the symmetrical English opening. And then from here we see d4. This is where we stop the symmetrical, and we are going to see Black take here on d4. You typically don't see it go past this. If you were to see d5, then we start to see some exchange on board. Then you're usually going to take the knight here. Then the queen comes off. Not necessarily terrible once the queen comes off that you are not going to castle anymore. But then you have 2 isolated pawns here on the c-file. Both sides have given up so much material early on. There's so much prep work that goes into this tournament. These are typically not the lines that you expect to see from these players. So we didn't see this. Instead, after the move d4, we see pawn take here on d4 and then knight take on d4. Jan continues with e6. And then we have g3. Just so many different options that Giri has in this spot. He could play e3, opening up for his light square bishop. He could even play e4 if he wanted to. He could get his dark square bishop involved into the game, bishop to f4. He decides to go ahead and play g3, preparing to fianchetto his bishop here to g3 or to g2 if he wants to. Queen comes down here to b6. This is just putting pressure on the center of the board here. The knight on d4. And then knight comes up here to b5. Now this is putting some pressure on the queen side for Black, and you have to be aware of this position. Many lower rated players would look at this and say, I got to kick this knight away. They may play something like a6, but really then White can just play d6, and then after the bishop, this is check. After the bishop takes, then the queen comes up here. And this is just a nuisance that Black's going to have to deal with. You can see both of these pawns here on a d7 and b7 are blocking the light square bishop. The king can't castle on the king side. Just not really the best spot that Black wants to be in. So instead, recognizing that the threat coming up here to d6, instead we have Jan playing knight to e5. So this is opening up the door for his queen to also control the square here on d6. It's a very nice move. Also still allows him to push forward with his d-pawn if he wants to get his light square bishop involved into the game. Bishop comes here to f4, immediately attacking this knight here on e5. And the knight comes down here to g4, defending this knight here on e5. Pawn to e3. Just opening up for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. Also gives another option if he wants to retake with his pawn here on f4 if there's a capture at some point. But now that Black has opened up for the queen to now control this square here on d6, can now freely play a6 here. But there's no good square for the knight to move here. We already talked about why it can't come here to d6 anymore, but you don't really want to bring it back here to a3 as well. So we do see Giri play h3 and says, I'll go ahead and exchange material here. You take my knight, I'll take your knight, and we'll have double pawns. You'll have on the b file, I'll have here on the g file, and we'll have semi-open files for both of our rooks. That's exactly what they do. Pawn takes here, pawn takes, and you can see semi-open file for this rook, semi-open file for this rook right here. Now I feel like this does favor Black in this position. Black's going to be looking to castle on the king side. He can start to attack with his rook here on the queen side. In this position, you're typically not going to see White castling on the queen side, and doesn't look as strong now to be castling on the king side either. So it'll be interesting to see how White's going to continue to put a lot of pressure on Black, but Black, I think, definitely has a better setup here. And then after the knight takes here on a c4, Black is up a pawn in material. That's going to be difficult later on to hold on to these double pawns here. But right now, this pawn on b5 doing a good job of supporting this knight here on c4 that just went up that pawn in material. We do see white play rook to c1 and then pawn down here to d5. Now, if it looks like the knight can just freely take here on b2, it's not quite that easy because the queen comes to b3. Now the bishop here on f1 is attacking this pawn here on b5. Also, the knight and the queen are both attacking it, and the queen is attacking this knight here on b2. So it's a little tricky. The knight can't just freely come up here because bishop takes here and the pawn can't recapture here because then the queen would fall. So that's definitely not going to be good for black. So how does black really continue? He may play queen to a5 and then bishop takes here, got that material back, and be queen to b4, castle on the king side after the queen takes, pawn takes here, but still this knight's in a tough spot. Eventually the rook can come here to c2. All in all, definitely not the best spot that black's going to be looking to b2. So that's why instead of the knight's coming down here to b2, instead we see d5. And this is what black was preparing even from early on with the pawn to e6, is extending with his pawn here on d5. Giri pushes forward with pawn to b3, trying to force this knight away. And then black comes down and plays bishop to b4, pinning down this knight to the king, also preparing to castle on the king side. I think you did have the opportunity just to play knight to e3. Don't always want to have your knights on the A or the H file, but this is down to your opponent's territory. It can stop a lot of the critical squares they would want to get to. Also, you can play bishop down here to b4 later on, but decides instead go ahead and play bishop down here to b4. Pawn takes on c4, and then rook down to a3. Don't have to take the knight right away. It is still pinning down the knight to the king. That's not going to change anytime soon. There's not like a bishop that can come back here. The dark square bishop is outside the pawn chain right here. So rook down to a3, adding more pressure on this knight here on c3. Bishop comes up to e5. Now just defending this material right here. Doesn't stop the pin that's going on, but does protect that square a little bit more. We do have f6 attacking the bishop. Bishop comes here to d4, and then queen a5. So just adding another attacker on the square here on c3. You can start to see a big attack coming here. And then bishop to e2, which I don't really think this is adding much to white's standpoint. You can see the queen and the bishop are both attacking this knight that's being pinned down to the king. Yes, if you play bishop to e2, you still have the option to castle on the king side, but remember, this setup is not really meant for white to castle on the king side. I don't know that that's what white would really want to be doing anyway, so in that case, I think you want to try something like king to e2. Just get out of the way of this fork right here. If there's an exchange, that's fine. But I really don't like just bring your bishop here to e2, because if you play king to e2, then maybe the pawn takes here on c4. I think that's fine. Maybe now the knight comes up here to e4. It's no longer being pinned down by the bishop and the queen. Maybe pawn e5. This is something that white can definitely get out of. But after bishop to e2, now the bishop takes on c3 check. Rook takes here, rook takes, and then king to f1. This is not going to be great if the bishop takes here. You can see bishop take, queen's going to recapture here. This is check after the king moves. Black just has a pretty dominant position here. The pawn can capture here on c4, and black is all up in white's business. After the king comes to f1, then pawn to b4. And I do think this is an opportunity that black could have improved on his position. He had pawn takes on c4. And yes, the bishop can take here, but as we just looked at, after the queen takes on c3, this is such a dominant position from black, and it's really difficult to see how white's going to continue in a good way. This pawn chain from black is very, very difficult to deal with. His pawn here on the B file can start to push forward. He can get his light square bishop involved into the game. He can even castle on the king side, swing his rook over here to the A file and start to attack as well. In the game, instead of taking this material right here, he plays B4, which may not want to give up that material right away. Or if the bishop takes, then he's going to recapture. But as soon as we see G5, we see E5 right here, but then the bishop takes, the pawn recaptures. It's so difficult for black to hold on to this material here on C3. Yes, it is in a dangerous spot, and white's going to have to deal with it, but no longer does black have his queen here on C3, adding a lot of pressure on his opponent. This pawn's not doing too much. Doesn't have a dark square bishop to come over here and defend this. It's going to be very difficult to have his pawn here on D4, and he doesn't have this pawn on C4 anymore. White now has that material. So I don't think this is as good a position that black could have been in. Still not the worst thing in the world. Pawn takes here on F6. Pawn recaptures. Now the queen comes over here to B1. It's not doing too much. I mean, yes, it's attacking both the pawn here on B7 and H7, but you know, I don't know how white's really going to continue too much here. Queen comes up here to C7, just stopping any sort of shenanigans. You know, the rook could potentially come up here to H7 and take right here. But this does stop that. Also can come down, take here on C4, get the material back at some point that I think he wanted to. Also defends if the bishop's still here, if he wants to take with his pawn here on C4. So it does have some couple options here. Queen to D3, pawn down here to B5. Just attacking the square here also keeps his queen, defending this square here on H7 if he feels like that is a long-term threat. Queen takes here on C3. As I said before, it was so difficult for black to hold on to that material here on C3. It just felt like he would have been better served if he had his queen here, but he didn't. So instead, the pawn takes here on C4. Pawn up here to E4. We do see an exchange in the center of the board, and now we have an isolated pawn that black has here on C4. Rook up here to H4, attacking the pawn. Bishop down to E6, defending this isolated pawn. So it has both the queen and the bishop attacking this, or defending this, and white has his queen and his bishop attacking this as well. The rook takes here on E4, and now white has 3 pieces attacking this pawn right here. So something's got to give. Black decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. Bishop takes here on C4. So now both sides are equal in material. This is pinning down the bishop, decides to go ahead and bring his king here to G7. And this is an interesting move. Queen to B3. Says, yeah, I'm going to put my queen and my bishop on this long light square diagonal. And then after rook to B8, this is where things start to take a pretty crazy turn here, because we see the bishop take on E6 and just leaves his queen right here. So he does get the queen, and he gives up his rook and his bishop. But this is a tough spot for white to deal with. Going into the endgame, a queen versus a bishop and rook typically ends in the queen dominating. So interesting to understand why Giri would continue down this path, but that's exactly what he did. Queen comes down here to C1, check. King to G2. Queen up here to C6. Chases this around the board a little bit. Pushes on the king side with H5. Rook to G8, check. This is being defended by the bishop here on B3, but pretty easy for the king to move around. No real way to put a lot of pressure on black at all. Can start to gobble up some material right here, and that's exactly what he does. But after queen to F3, we see rook to H8. Pawn down here to E4, just putting more pressure on his opponent. Rook to D8, check. After the bishop comes down here to D1, this is going to allow rook down here to D5, and this has the rook and the bishop attacking this pawn right here on H5. Pawn comes down, and white is able to get that material. So did a lot of work to get that pawn and material, but it's still very difficult for him to continue here. After F5, we see rook to F5, and I think this was a mistake by white here, because it does allow black to come down. Queen to E1, check. and this is going to be giving up this material here on d1. So after king to g2, we see the queen take, and yes, it's nice that he has this pawn. He's going to try to hold on to this as much as possible, but really this queen can do a lot of work. And all these pawns from white, they have a long way to go before they can get promoted. It's going to be very difficult for white to just push up the board. Black can stop the king from going anywhere, and the rook all by itself against a queen is just very, very difficult to push any of the material up. Now we see rook to g5. It doesn't really save too much. If you look at it and say just play rook to e5, check, you can get the pawn. Yes, that's true, but after king f6, the rook takes here, then rook up here to d5, pinning down the rook to the king here. Probably f3 supporting that, but then the queen can just take here on a2. Again, black doesn't need that pawn. It does add an extra layer of threat to the board for black, but this queen can do all the work. Gobble up all the material, checkmate his opponent, doesn't really need that. So white looks at that and says, okay, I got to hold on to as much material as possible. These past pawns are pretty much all I have going for me, so decides not to give up that pawn right away. Play rook here to g5, but queen over here to a1. There's just no good way to stop that. Says, okay, yeah, I'll just go ahead and concede that. But queen to b1 says, I'm not ready to give up my rook or my pawn here on e4 just yet. Rook down here to g3. Loses his pawn. Rook over here to h3. So black doing a good job of being able to gobble up all the pawns from white and not even giving up his pawn here on e4. And for the rest of the game, it really comes down to just choking white out of any potential moves here. You can see that the king is isolated, can't really go anywhere. All black's really trying to do is get his king into a position to start to gobble up material. This pawn here on h4 is the first square that he's trying to capture here. And just slowly squeezing white out of the game here. All it can really do is just move the rook back and forth, but at the end of the day, that's not doing too much. And so eventually, once we get to move 73, we have white coming here to e3, and then queen up here to d3. And in this spot, we have an Giri resigning in the game. And Jan Nepo, who I have as the dark horse to win the tournaments, wins game number 1. Now, these players met at Tata Steel in 2019, the Masters round of the top players in the world. And same thing happened with the black pieces. Jan won that game, and Giri went on to be +4 on the tournament. So had a massive comeback against the top players in the world. 14 games that they'll be played in the Candace tournament. So he has 13 games left. It's not the end of the world. Definitely not the start that he wanted, especially with the white pieces. You usually have some strong preparation coming into it. He started with the English opening, something you don't see all that often, so he put a lot of time and energy into this specific opening. And at the end of the day, Jan just came out and had a crucial win. Was very interesting to see that at the very end game, then Giri went with giving up his queen in exchange to have a rook and bishop versus queen endgame. Don't think that was necessarily the route that he would have liked to go down, but it did not end up well for him. But all in all, it was a fantastic game. We don't see something like this too early in a lot of these tournaments in one of the first few rounds. These wild openings that we don't see that often. Very decisive game from black here. So hopefully guys enjoyed round number 1. For anyone that was watching it live, Magnus Carlsen was giving a lot of commentary. Always fun to watch him. Pretty funny guy giving analysis on these players, but getting really in-depth analysis. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the recap. I'll be doing this every single day. They do play 3 days on, and then they take a day off, 3 days on again. I'll be picking one game from each day and giving commentary on that. But thank you guys so much for watching, and then I'll see you tomorrow in game number 2.